Hello and welcome to the second From Time to Time a Poem. I'm Deborah Ellis, a teacher in a liceo in Vicenza and author for Loescher Editore and Helbling Languages. In this presentation, I wanted to share with you two extraordinary poems by the Irish poet Eavan Boland. So the presentation is divided into the introduction and then two more parts, one for each poem. Don't miss the second poem, which is called Quarantine, and which, if possible, is even more beautiful than the first. So there are two poems which demand a strong focus on context, which once it's been understood really allows an appreciation of the story, of the simple language, but powerful imagery and message. So why Eavan Boland? Well, one of the ways in which I tend to keep up to date on contemporary poets and their works, and which helps me to kind of distinguish between a passing fad and a poet who is more likely to become a classic, is to look at the exam syllabuses for English literature in various English-speaking countries. And I discovered that Eavan Boland is an absolute must on the Irish Leaving Certificate syllabus. You cannot graduate from secondary school in Ireland without becoming absolutely intimate with her works. And what struck me was how little known such a well-established national poet is in England, unlike, say, Seamus Heaney. In fact, she is a poet of national standing who has inherited a very rich literary past, but a male-dominated literary past. And as a female poet standing in the shadow of all these male greats, Boland talks of her determination to find her own voice. And she claims that if over time you find enough of your voice, you can change the acoustic around the voice, which she certainly has managed to do, both in Ireland and in the US, where she worked as a lecturer at Stanford University in California. And she writes about women, about marriage, about children, and she also writes poems with a strong political message. However, even when she's writing politically, she tells her story and puts across her message by simply recounting small incidents, life's shadows and whispers, as she puts it. In fact, she distinguishes the past from history. History is the official version or official versions, with all that entails, whereas the past is made up of ordinary people and small gestures which tell huge stories. So whether you're teaching or learning about Ireland and the Irish question, or maybe you're examining the great literary tradition of Ireland, or perhaps dealing with colonialism and its effects, maybe you're looking at the poor laws and workhouses of the mid-1800s, or maybe you are studying contemporary poetry, poets such as Seamus Heaney, and you think a woman also deserves a look in. You might even be talking about illness and quarantine in your lessons, given the period. These two poems might give you some more ideas and are certainly worth exploiting. So our first poem is called That the Science of Cartography is Limited. An intriguing title. Cartography, the study of maps, a precise, accurate science. But also, when you consider that maps are also cultural artifacts, they actually tell us an awful lot about the time that they were produced, and that can actually constitute their power. So the poem begins with reading the title as part of the first stanza. That the science of cartography is limited, and not simply by the fact that this shading of forest cannot show the fragments of balsam, the gloom of cypresses, is what I wish to prove. So we know that when a map is made, it cannot capture the feeling of a place, its sensorial features, the colours, the shades, the smells, the sounds, the textures offered by the landscape. Now that is clear, we all agree on that. A map cannot show those things. But the voice here in the poem is saying to us that she wants to show us something more than that, something else that maps cannot show us. And the poem continues like this. When you and I were first in love, we drove to the borders of Connacht and entered a wood there. Look down, you said. This was once a famine road. I looked down at ivy and the scutch grass rough cast stone had disappeared into, as you told me in the second winter of their ordeal in 1847, when the crop had failed twice. Relief committees gave the starving Irish such roads to build. So they were taken on a journey. We go into the countryside with a young couple who are in love. And as they walk in the countryside, they come across a wood, and in the wood, a disused and abandoned road. A road which takes us on another journey, this time into the past, back to the winter of 1847. When you see that idea of 1847, of course, what comes to mind is the period of the Irish famine, the Great Hunger. When I saw 1847 and I thought about the Great Famine, I immediately thought about the potato. It's kind of an accepted basic truth that the problem which caused the Irish famine was the potato harvest, right? And the potato, the Irish lumper, which dominated the Irish diet, and the fact that a fungus, as explained here on the History Channel, a fungus spread rapidly and infested and ruined the majority of the potato crop. I mean, the History Channel here gives the version of events which I have always known and always considered the truth. The cause was a fungus. It attacked the potato crop, and 1 million Irish died from starvation. That's 1/8 of the entire population died of starvation. And between 1 or 2 million more emigrated to escape the suffering and to escape death. Now, I started reading different sources to get more information about the famine and realized that there were different shades to the story that was being told of that period. The BBC, in fact, gave a slightly different account and suggests that other factors were at play, which included the laissez-faire attitude or the actions of the Whig government of the time, which actually exacerbated the situation and made the famine situation even worse. Other sources were giving me a variety of points of view. Boland speaks about the dubious science of cartography, but what I was discovering as I looked through the sources was the many versions of history, the many ways in which it can be reported and interpreted. Absolutely fascinating. I mean, for example, the Encyclopedia Britannica talks about the potato had become the staple crop. Had become. It doesn't give you any idea how that happened unless you read on a little, and it says that perhaps it was a crop that was easy to grow in the Irish soil, almost inferring that the Irish had taken the easy way out by becoming dependent on a single staple crop. Whereas something, looking at Queen's University Belfast, for example, I found the Great Famine referred to as genocide. So hugely differing points of view. It would definitely be a fascinating piece of research to put all these accounts side by side and look at all the versions of the truth, in inverted commas, that there are about the famine. I eventually found a source which I felt was less emotionally charged, or attempted to place the facts before me. And this was from a 2019 academic paper, which was actually about infection shaping history, because it was by an association called the American Clinical and Climatological Association. However, the introduction to this academic paper gave a good summary of the events leading up to the famine and of events during the famine. And what I discovered, or what I needed reminding of very strongly, was the fact that if the potato became the staple, the basic element of the Irish diet, there was a good reason for that. Let me just read the first paragraph with you. By the late 17th century, the potato was widely used in Ireland to supplement main diet of dairy and grain products. So a supplement in the late 17th century. Over time, Irish tenants were pushed off the better land and forced to farm smaller plots of marginal land. Increasingly, they turned to the potato as it was a crop that could be grown abundantly in less favourable soil and was sufficiently nutritious to provide general sustenance. By the first 2 decades of the 18th century, it had become the base food. Look at the part in yellow. Holdings were so small and the soil was so poor that no crop other than the potato would suffice to feed a family. Here we're not talking about a choice about growing something that's easy to grow. We're talking about people being forced to find a single crop which can provide for the family and which can grow in such poor conditions. And so once the blight occurs, we're going to find the whole population forced into a situation in which they are completely vulnerable. Now, once the famine has taken a hold, Britain is then forced to think about relief. And poor relief was based on the idea that no one should receive charity. No one should ride on the shoulders of the person who is, or the country who is supporting them. If you wanted food, money, or assistance, you had to work to earn it. The problem was that people suffering from malnutrition, vitamin deficiency, fever, and infections were physically extremely weak and unable to work. Nevertheless, it happened that they were put to work, and one such work that was on offer in return for poor relief was road building. Roads which were to become known as the Famine Roads, and which are dotted all over the Irish landscape. To be frank, I had never heard of the Famine Roads, so another thing I needed to find out more about. In fact, in the poem, the next part of the poem, Boland says, in 1847, when the crop had failed twice, relief committees gave the starving Irish such roads to build. So what were the Famine Roads? Like the types of work done in workhouses, for example, stone breaking, they had no real purpose. These jobs had no real purpose other than to avoid giving relief as charity. And the roads that were built went nowhere. They had no direction in mind. They served no purpose. They were built for the sake of making men labour. And they can be seen, as I said, dotted across the Irish countryside, going nowhere, leading to nowhere, and suddenly stopping completely. I found an account written by a a young Irish student back in the 1930s. He or she really gives us a good idea of what the Famine Roads were and how high their cost was. Famine Roads. During the famine years in this district, a road was being made through Mr. John Connor's and Mr. Murphy's glen in Crowhill. The work was never completed because the country was too poor. There were all big strong men working there. A penny a day was their wages. They used to live on oaten meal. They died in large numbers there because the pay was too small and the meal was too dear. The remains of the road can still be seen there. They died in large numbers there because the pay was too small and the meal was too dear. The next line in the poem, in fact, reads, "Where they died, there the road ended." We're talking about undernourished people trying to earn their food to survive, dying of exhaustion. So going back to Boland's original question, why is the science of cartography limited? Because it cannot show the pain, the suffering, the loss, the horror of the Irish road builders, just as it cannot show the cruelty of those who controlled the poor relief. Let's read the full poem. That the science of cartography is limited, and not simply by the fact that this shading of forest cannot show the fragments of balsam, the gloom of cypresses, is what I wish to prove. When you and I were first in love, we drove to the borders of Connaught and entered a wood there. "Look down," you said. "This was once a famine road." I looked down at ivy and the scutch grass rough-cast stone had disappeared into, as you told me in the second winter of their ordeal, in 1847, when the crop had failed twice. Relief committees gave the starving Irish such roads to build. Where they died, there the road ended. And ends still when I take down the map of this island. It is never so I can say, here is the masterful, the apt rendering of the spherical as flat, nor an ingenious design which persuades a curve into a plane. But to tell myself again that the line which says woodland and cries hunger and gives out among sweet pine and cypress and finds no horizon will not be there. So the next poem is called Quarantine. It's also about the Irish famine. And when I saw that the poem was called Quarantine, I wondered how a word which has become part of our everyday lives at the moment could be associated with the Great Famine back in 1847. Well, from the previous academic article that we were looking at, I also learned the shocking fact that only 10 to 15% of the population died from starvation. Contagious diseases spread by close contact and fleas accounted for many more deaths. Diseases such as typhoid, relapsing fever or famine fever, and typhus, cholera and smallpox. Famine fever or relapsing fever was a fever that came in bouts. A first bout, which was not too severe, the person would seem to recover, and then within a period of time they would fall back into a second bout, which was worse than the first, and so on in a series of bouts until the person was completely debilitated and would probably die. So how were these diseases passed from person to person? The basic choice during the famine was either starvation or emigration, or to work for your relief, either in a labour gang, such as the road building gangs that we saw previously, or in the workhouse. Now, many thousands crowded into the workhouses looking for relief. And inside those walls, of course, there was no room for social distancing. It was a breeding place for disease, a place where contagion spread from person to person. So, if a workhouse inmate fell ill, they were forced into quarantine. Now, quarantine for the infected was in sheds or tents built outside the walls of the local hospital, if there was one, or more often than not, people were sent back to their homes to self-isolate, where they had to fight on alone against illness, starvation, and of course the freezing cold. The poem Quarantine, which we're going to read, is not just a poem about that moment of history. It's also an incredible love poem. It describes a small incident, a small gesture, which becomes transformed into a story of true heroism and love amidst the desperate suffering. I want you to imagine that we are in the depths of winter, and a man and his wife have been living, surviving in the workhouse. The woman contracts famine fever, and they are forced to quarantine. They are forced to leave the workhouse, to go home to self-isolate, because she has contracted the fever. In the worst hour of the worst season, of the worst year of a whole people, a man set out from the workhouse with his wife. He was walking. They were both walking north. She was sick with famine fever and could not keep up. He lifted her and put her on his back. He walked like that, west and north, until at nightfall, under freezing stars, they arrived. In the morning they were both found dead, of cold, of hunger, of the toxins of a whole history. But her feet were held against his breastbone. The last heat of his flesh was his last gift to her. Let no poem, no love poem ever come to this threshold. There is no place here for the inexact praise of the easy graces and sensuality of the body. There is only time for this merciless inventory. Their death together in the winter of 1847. Also what they suffered, how they lived, and what there is between a man and a woman, and in which darkness it can best be proved. Thank you.